May I speak in the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. The writer Elizabeth Oldfield recently said this: "I've spent a lot of time this year telling audiences of all sizes to just go to church. For most of them, this is a new or strange idea. But I have concluded that our most pressing challenges have a common root: the loss of habits of collective ritual, shared attention, and community." She continues, "I warn them that if they do show up to church, they will most likely find it annoying. But there isn't an alternative. We don't seem to be able to do without it. Ultimately, to whom else can we go?" She says that just recently she did this at the end of a talk, and 7 people came up to her and just said, I'm going to go. I'm going to go to church. And they did. Just yesterday, in the Times newspaper, the columnist Giles Corran announced that he was giving up atheism for Lent. And for good. Elizabeth Oldfield is absolutely right. Christian faith is powerful. We need it, and our culture crumbles without it. But it can also go wrong. So it is vital to be able to spot the difference between good and bad religion. This talk, therefore, is a little bit like a flight attendant talk. If you're on a flight, you're like, okay, we're going to Madrid. Yeah, we're going to Madrid. Great. It's going to be fantastic. It's going to be great. But just in case something goes wrong, you need to know that the emergency exits are here and here and here, right? Christianity can be absolutely life-changing and world-transforming. But there is such a thing as bad religion. And when it happens, we need to call it out. In fact, the Bible has a lot to say about bad religion. There's a lot of bad religion in the Bible. It's as if the act of reading the Bible is an exercise in working out what is good and what is bad. And we're going to see that by looking at Ezekiel, that we had wonderfully read for us just then, and Jesus, and thinking about it today. And I want to give you the first this week of 2 tests of good religion, the second one coming next week. So let's begin with Ezekiel. Ezekiel is a prophet who lived about 600 years before Jesus. And he spoke for God at a time when people were tempted to give up on faith. And Ezekiel can understand why. He can understand why people are giving up on faith. And it's all to do, for Ezekiel, with the temple. If you read the book of Ezekiel, it's all about the temple. Here is the temple built by Solomon, King Solomon. And the temple was the heart of religion. The temple was, in a sense, what religion was all about. It was the center and the home of Israel's religion. It was where you went to meet with God. It was where you went to be cleansed. It was where you went to see God's goodness. But it had gone bad. God, earlier in the book of Ezekiel, gave him a kind of vision, a kind of X-ray vision, to be able to see into the heart of the temple. And what he sees is not good. We've got some verses from Ezekiel we can put up here. He said to me, "Son of man, now dig into the wall." So he sees the walls of the temple, and God says to him, "I want you to dig into the walls of the temple." So I dug into the wall and saw a doorway there, and he said to me, "Go in and see the wicked and detestable things they are doing there." So God is saying to his prophet, I want you to dig into religion. I want you to dig into what's happening here. And I'm going to show you what's really at its heart, because that's what is most important. And what he sees is people turning away from God. This is in the early chapters of Ezekiel. Turning away from God, breaking God's rules. And then Ezekiel looks around the city and he says, the land is full of bloodshed and the city is full of injustice. So Ezekiel sees violence, he sees unfairness, and if you read the book of Ezekiel, one of the things that really bothers him is money lending. He sees money being lent for interest, and he condemns it absolutely, because he feels it's unfair on the poor. And finally, the last text up here, he says, I looked and I saw the glory of the Lord departed from over the threshold of the temple. God has gone. Ezekiel sees the glory of the Lord leave the temple. He sees bad religion and he calls it out. Faith in the true God is not supposed to be like this. It's not supposed to be deceitful. It's not supposed to be unfaithful. It's not supposed to be unjust. And so God says, I'm out. Not in my name. I am out. So do you see, the prophet Ezekiel calls out bad religion. Most of the book is him calling out bad religion. There's a couple of rather famous chapters at the end, which we tend to read in church. Most of the book is calling out bad religion. Now, here's the saving grace, okay? Here's the saving grace. So I titled this Bad Religion, and it's been added in brackets, How Not to Do It. It's a bit embarrassing talking about bad religion in church. I think it's really important. It's not that religion is always good. It's not that Christianity is always healthy. It isn't. Christians can do terrible things. Even Bible-believing Christians, if you like, can do terrible things. Look at the history of slavery in the United States, for instance, but not only there. Look at the history of apartheid in South Africa. But at the heart of our faith is a correction mechanism. The Bible has its own internal correction mechanism. It's called the prophets. God makes sure that no matter how bad society gets, no matter how far his people drift away, there is somebody or a group of people who have spiritual vision and the courage to stand up and in the power of God's Spirit say, I'm calling this out. This is bad religion. In that sense, the Bible is a little bit like the black box recorder that you get in civilian airplanes. If there is a tragedy, an air crash, then commercial planes have inside them the black box recorder. And the black box recorder tells you what were people saying before the crash happened? What were they doing before the crash happened? Because if we could understand that, then we could prevent this terrible thing happening again. Now, I don't know if you realize this. Ezekiel lived within years of a temple crash because Solomon's temple was reduced to rubble. Now, here's the parallel. Jesus also lived within years of a temple crash. Within a few decades, the temple was reduced to rubble, as Jesus himself said it would be. Ezekiel and Jesus are like a black box recorder. They tell us what was going wrong. What were people thinking? What were people doing? What caused this catastrophe to happen? Because if we can pay attention to that, even though it might be a bit humiliating, even though it might be a bit difficult, if we can pay attention to it, then we will learn from mistakes. God gets no glory from everybody pretending that everything is fine. And God's goodness is never served by refusing to challenge authorities when they turn their back on God's love. It is not wrong to call out bad religion. In fact, it is our job. Now, I'm not saying we should be hypercritical all the time and nasty to each other. I'm not saying we should go around on our own judging other Christians. But I am saying that we have a responsibility to do faith right and to acknowledge the times our religion has caused harm. And that is what Ezekiel does. But God also gives Ezekiel something else, and that's what we had read to us. God also gives Ezekiel a vision of a new temple. And it's really important what this new temple is like. First of all, in chapter 40, 41, 42, he says it's straight, it's true, it's perfectly measured. It's got no secret chambers. But also, if we have these words up, he says this, I saw the glory of the God of Israel coming from the east. The glory of the Lord entered the temple. Here's his vision. God is going to come back. God is going to fill the temple with his glory once again. And as a result, something amazing happens. The temple starts to leak. Now, if you live or are responsible for a house, or if you own a house, the one thing you don't want in a house is a leak. You don't want what in technical terms is called ingress. Okay? You don't want ingress. You don't want water coming into your house. You want the taps, showers, good. Leaks, bad. Okay? You don't even want any egress, water coming out of your house. You don't want any kind of ingress, egress, any of that. Okay? But Ezekiel sees this new temple, and it's got water flowing out of it. I saw water coming out from under the threshold of the temple. It's coming out under the doors. This water's coming out. And then the man who he's with starts to measure it. He says, well, it starts like a trickle. But then you go along 1,000 cubits, and it's like ankle deep. And then you go along 1,000 cubits, it's like knee deep. And then you go along, and it's waist deep. And then it gets so deep, you couldn't even swim across it. And it starts to flow out into the sea. It's an incredible thing. And where the river flows, everything will live. That's what this is about. Out of the temple flows life. This isn't about a temple. This temple, the temple that Ezekiel saw, it was never actually built. Something with those measurements never ever existed. It wasn't about the temple. It was about healthy religion. A way of knowing God, which is right and good, and out of it flows life. In fact, the life that flows from it is so abundant. It not only begins as a trickle, it begins to become like a flood, like a river delta across the whole coast. And everywhere that it hits the salt water, or most places it turns it pure. And wherever the river flows, everything will live. And there's trees on either side, and they provide fruit, and their leaves are for healing. This is what religion should be like. When God renews the temple, he fills it with his presence, and from God's presence comes life. Now, if that is what Ezekiel says, you may know about Jesus and his teaching in the Gospels, and there are some incredible parallels with what Jesus came to say, especially in the book of John, the Gospel of John. If we read about Jesus in the Gospel of John, you will see that one of the first things Jesus does, only in John's Gospel, not the other three, one of the first things Jesus does is he goes to the temple, chapter 2. This time it's Herod's temple, not Solomon's temple. And the first thing he does is he calls out bad religion. And he drives people out of the temple. And he talks about God bringing a new temple, just like Ezekiel did. But John says the temple he spoke about was his body. that would be destroyed and raised. We'll come back to that in a moment. Now that's chapter 2. Later in John's gospel, Jesus goes down to Jerusalem again. He goes and he teaches by the temple, and he's teaching there. And then John says these words. He says, Jesus stood up, and in a loud voice he said, "Whoever believes in me, as Scripture has said," by which he means probably as Ezekiel has said, "rivers of living water will flow from within them." So we heard that Ezekiel said there's going to be a new temple and water is going to flow from that temple. And now Jesus is saying, do you know what? There's going to be a new temple and water is going to flow from you. If you believe me, water is going to flow from you. God's Spirit, God's life is going to flow through you. It's going to bubble up inside and overflow in you. And just later, Jesus is talking. He's talking about the religious leaders in Israel. He calls them shepherds. He says, do you know what? They were thieves and they were robbers because they only came to steal and to kill and to destroy. That's what bad religion does. It steals and it kills and it destroys. And Jesus says, the thief comes to steal and kill and destroy, but I have come that they may have life and have it to overflowing. Overflowing. You may have heard that as have it in abundance, but the word is overflow. Do you see? It's the same picture. It's this picture of God not just coming into a building, but coming into your heart and my heart and entering into our heart with his presence. And when God enters into our life, his Spirit causes living water to flow through us and to bubble up inside us and to flow out, and so that we will make a difference in the world for life and for healing. That is what Jesus came to do. That's his promise. Now it so happens that just as Ezekiel said that, do you know that river is going to get so deep, you won't be able to cross it. Jesus also said, he said, I have more to say to you, more than you can bear, but when the Spirit comes, he will lead you into all truth. There's things that you don't even yet understand, but I'm going to lead you. This river is going to flow. It's going to take you to new places. That's relevant because Ezekiel, when he saw the temple and he saw what was wrong with it, he said, well, what's wrong with it is like Gentiles, like non-Jewish people. That's a problem in the book of Ezekiel. And there's food which is unclean. That's a problem in the book of Ezekiel. And, as I said earlier, there's money being lent and there's interest charged on that money, and that's a problem. Ezekiel saw the vision, but he didn't know where the river was going to lead. He didn't know that Jesus would throw open the doors so that every people group and every kind of person could come to him. And that the people who followed Jesus would not be known by their food laws. And about 1,200 to 1,500 years after Jesus, the church would find that there were ways of lending money and charging interest, which were not always bad. And so the river of the Spirit keeps flowing, and we follow where God is leading, and we don't always see all of what God is bringing, but we know there is more. There's always more of the life and the goodness of God. So, Ezekiel called out bad religion. And in its place, he had a vision of a new temple flowing out with living water. And Jesus called out bad religion. And in its place, he said his own body would be a temple that God raised from the dead. And he did. And that each of our bodies could be filled with his Holy Spirit so that life would overflow in us and through us. And so that gives us our first test. I said there'll be 2 tests. We'll do the second one next week. But the first test of religion is simply this: the test of life. The test of life. Does it lead to life? It's probably a good test to ask of anything you do, not just religion. There's that song, actually, I was remembering it, it came out a few years ago. Everything that kills me makes me feel alive. Well, that's a lie. God, who made the world, gives a gift of life. He's the God of life, and you can test whether something is good, whether something comes from God, and whether it leads to God with a simple test of life. Is there life in it? Does it lead to healing? That doesn't mean that it's always easy to follow God. It's not always easy. It doesn't mean we're all going to agree a whole time about following God. That's not going to happen either. But there is a test of life. Let me say, this is why safeguarding is so important in the church. It's not that it's kind of nice to have, that children should be safe and that vulnerable people should be protected and that everybody should be safe from fear and protected from abuse of any kind. It's not an additional extra. It's what God's life is supposed to be like. It's not like a kind of a license to trade as a church. It is the business of the church to be a place of life and safety and health. And when that doesn't happen, we need to call it out. The song we began the service with, Blessed Be Your Name, was written by somebody called Matt Redman. And he last year released a video called Let There Be Light, where he publicly called out behavior that was wrong. And thank goodness that he did that. It applies to big festivals, it applies to leadership teams, it applies to everything that's done in God's name. It should be safe because God is the God of life and it's a test of life. If you're a Christian, you can apply that test of life to the church, to things you're involved in. We do need to get involved, like Elizabeth Oldfield said at the start. It makes a difference when we commit ourselves, when we get involved in church. But if you see something where there isn't life, then you are free to speak out in the church of God. And you are free to make a change. I have a brief confession on this point. I've never preached this before, but when I was a teenager, I nearly joined a cult. See a look of slight concern rippling across. My friend had gone into Manchester. He came and said, Mark, I've met these Christians. They're real Christians. Like they do New Testament Christianity, like the real stuff, the pure stuff. I was like, really? Yes, wow. We should go and meet these people. So we went to met these people. And sure enough, they had everything decided in clean, straight lines. Like the whole building was strong. They knew what they believed. Everybody knew what they believed. Everybody was on the same page. Everybody was 100% committed. I thought, that's amazing. It's like the early Christians. And I went around to a few of their things. I went to one of their services. I joined one of their groups to discuss the Bible. But something just did not sit right. I didn't know much. I didn't have the tools to make that decision, but I just knew that something wasn't right. I couldn't explain it then, but I can tell you what it is now. They had all the structures, they had all the walls, but there was no river of life. There was no river of life. I don't know whether your experience has been paganism or Islam or different kinds of Christianity. Let me tell you, everybody, there's a whole bunch of us that like some structure. But don't just look for structure. Look for the life. Look for the life which leads to healing, because that's a sign of the Spirit of God. And if you are thinking about faith, you're thinking about taking that step, it is an invitation to life. It's an invitation to a form of life that promises and offers to make you less addicted, more loving, wiser, and more free. It's a wonderful example of this. Just last month, Larry Sanger, if we could have a picture of Larry Sanger up here, he's the co-founder of Wikipedia. He described himself as a skeptical philosopher, an unbelieving philosopher, and he announced last month that after 35 years as a non-believer, he's changed his mind. Now, back in 2015, he wrote this. He said, Christianity instructed people to work hard, to hope for a better life, to treat others kindly and donate to charity, to practice the graces of humility and self-respect, to rein in our passions and practice moderation, to take responsibility for ourselves and our dependents, and much more. He's right. It wasn't all good, but much of it was. It taught the idea of obligation, which has grown much weaker for many of us. It was an organizing, all-encompassing core part of the Western civic culture, but really no more. So as I say, as a serious cultural force, inspiring us to live well, religion is a pale shadow of its former self. Even as a non-believer, this strikes me as a truly profound loss. 2015. Okay, in 2019, he wrote this. What makes humanity lovable is that which supports and delights flourishing, well-ordered life. If so, then the love of God may be understood as a perfectly natural love of the supremely creative force in the universe. For what could be greater than the creator of the universe? And what could be more lovable? That was 2019. Now, he describes what happened in 2020. There was a moment soon after I started reading the Gospels, which was towards the end of February 2020, when I said I should admit to myself that I now believe in God and pray to God, so I should pray to God properly. I did so silently and eyes closed, lying in bed. That was 2020. This is last month. He put this on his webpage. It is finally time for me to confess and explain fully and publicly that I am a Christian. I thank God for what share of insight his word and his faithful servants have given me as I've studied them. I thank God for the gift that for most of my life, I never imagined I would have. Isn't that beautiful? The gift that for most of my life, I never imagined I would have. Do you see, Larry Sanger had this hunch that religion leads to life, that good religion leads to life, and he was right. But actually, God led him on a journey. And in the end, he's jumping into the river himself. And God's given him life. That life bubbling up inside of him. So that's why I want to end this week's talk, is just that invitation. If you're looking for life, and Jesus offers life, a life that he died to give to you. And if you call yourself a Christian, don't be afraid to use that test of life to follow where God is at work and to call out bad religion. And maybe even if this Sunday morning you need a touch of God's life and healing. And that's why we gather as a church, so we can pray for one another and know God's life and God's blessing. So I wonder if I could invite us to do that now. If you're able and comfortable to do so, if you'd love to stand, then the band's going to come up and we're just going to respond to his word.